Hi, everyone. Before we start, just a reminder, today's talk is being recorded and live streamed on Zoom. So if you ask any questions during the talk, they will be included in today's recording. I'm so pleased to have Abigail Jacobs here with us today. She's a professor at the School of Information and Health Systems at the University of Michigan. And previously, she completed a postdoc right here at Berkeley. So it's a wild time in AI. Benchmarks are crumbling as reliable metrics. Industry has proclaimed an evaluation crisis, while simultaneously organizations are scrambling to deploy these systems ASAP. But Abby's cooler head prevails. She has done incredible work considering how we should measure AI performance, how to adopt a sociotechnical approach to governing AI systems, and how to ensure that technology is not just doing well under a limited technical metric, but also actually advancing broader public goals. If you haven't had a chance to hear her speak yet, you're in for a real treat. Please join me in welcoming our bellwether lecture speaker, Abigail Jacobs.
Thank you all. It's been really lovely being here so far. I was actually really struck because I've been having all these one-on-one meetings with people who are deeply familiar with my work and asking extremely insightful questions. And so, unfortunately, those people might be slightly disappointed because I'm going to step back and talk about a bunch of different things. But I just wanted to really express my gratitude for being here and having just a lovely experience so far. And I'm giving a talk, which is like talks I've given before. I've recently become more explicit about the stakes of what I'm thinking about in terms of hidden governance of AI. And I just wanted to sort of walk you through sort of where I've been coming from and who I've been thinking about intervening on and what I'm thinking about overall. So let me first say something about governance of AI or by AI, and then I'll give you a preview of where we're going. So, I may run into all sorts of, I'm going to governance broadly defined, thinking about things that determine what counts as a real name or a politically prescribed gender identity or types of qualities that we might have systems increasingly choose to measure for us, things that companies are willing to say that they do and are measuring and are interested in. And these are all kinds of sort of social concepts that are ending up being instrumented by people that weren't previously as involved doing that, let's say. And I want to just, again, set the stakes that these types of governance decisions are the things that are structuring our life chances, about what types of information we have access to, what types of opportunities we have, and sort of this really sort of vulgar level of sort of infrastructural background of what gets encoded as what map from 2011 ends up being used for current day decision making. So I just really want to sort of give us this kind of overall context that I want to think about what kind of governance is happening of and by AI as we think about what kinds of systems we're interested in and why. And so this might be an odd introduction if you know me or not. But I want to sort of tell you where I've come from. My PhD was in computer science, but I've spent that time working with social scientists, talking to legal scholars, and my primary intervention has really all been around what I've been calling measurement. And the cheap way I talk about this is that words mean things. And that's actually a big lesson for computer scientists, and that I'm not going to be out of a job by continuing to make that point. Specifically, we're going to talk about sort of how words are being made to mean things. You're going to see some sort of information school inflection here. But I want to show you sort of what my original intervention on computer science was, how that's going now, and specifically interrogating this process that I call measurement to think about sort of what types of values are encoded in our technical systems, often implicitly, often in sort of very hidden and diffuse, disorganized ways. And in particular, the thing that I sort of get most excited about is, thinking about how technical tools are used to launder legitimacy and authority and objectivity, and thinking about sort of what is being laundered, where, and what is at stake. And so, I think we can start to imagine how current policy around things like what is an age-appropriate system and what information do you need to get access to that, what is an intelligent system, what is high-quality language that is worth reproducing. These are all social concepts. I'm going to talk about these as constructs. And just as a background, a thing that I put in very light lettering here, but is often sort of the role I am taking in a particular type of computer science audience, is that, society exists, culture is relevant, and shows up with how we interact with the world and interpret the world. And that's going to be important because these squishy words are operationalized in all sorts of ways in AI, but all sorts of algorithmic systems, where we say what counts as quality language, what counts as, AI is a lawyer now who is qualified for this job. And so I really want to draw attention to this process of the sort of social squishy thing being turned into these sort of instantiations that we care about. And for me, a lens that I like to draw on in particular is measurement theory from the quantitative social sciences. So not just psychometrics, but beyond things like political science, people who've thought a lot about what it means to try to represent these kinds of squishy social concepts, be clear about what kinds of assumptions people are making. And because this gives us language to think about how we can clarify concepts, identify stakeholders. I claim that this is actually really useful for us thinking about decisions and harms and types of evaluative goals we might have. And so by building on this language of measurement and bringing that to computer scientists, my claim is that this gives us some kind of rigorous structured way to think about the decisions that we're making anyways, and in particular, think about what then the outcomes of that are. So I'll give you some caveats and more thoughts on this as we go through. But one of the earliest sort of interventions we were pointing out is that, of course, there is it's this clear place where harms emerge when there's a mismatch between things that we are claiming to represent. This is how safe the system is. This is, what a good teacher is, and what actually gets implemented. But often these disagreements often are held at what I would call the operationalization layer, which are focused on technical audiences, away from sort of domain relevant contexts, away from people whose lives are being impacted, and that this is a way to also sort of distract and exclude people from the governance happening around them. So just to set some language for how I'm going to talk about things, I would make the case that measurement is everywhere, but it's usually implicit. Again, this can go from things like, by fairness, I mean actually like equality of outcomes across sort of these inferred groups that are based on last names, based on some list, whatever. I can come up with whatever kind of system to say what I mean by fairness, or teacher quality, or intelligent. If I were a social scientist, I'd be like, yeah, this is fine. I have some construct, I have some idea of thing I want to do. I'm going to come up, I'm going to operationalize that, and have some way to measure that, and I'm going to use these measurements so I can lay out all of my assumptions and identify where things go wrong. But unfortunately, we are in this world. We do not have such a clean path between, oh, I would like to build my toxic language detector, or I'm going to sort of take this system off the shelf and it's going to be general purpose. I'm going to use that and I'm going to make claims about how all of these sort of social and informational goals, and just we're going to go forward. So in ML world, we have to deal with the fact that these decisions, if they're made explicitly at all about what we mean by things like, safety or privacy or quality, deservedness of a job. These are all things that are going to be diffuse, hidden, and that's sort of in the design process, never mind in the sort of larger organizational and business ecosystems that sort of put these systems together. And so why I'm just sort of making this particular claim about measurement theory specifically, not only does it give us some language for the things that we try to measure are different than the things that we actually do, which is, again, this is sort of my original core intervention after having going to computer science conferences over and over again. having trouble articulating or having trouble with having my audience understand that those are distinct. But I would also argue that this gives us access to, again, sort of rigorous tools to think about reliability and contract validity. I'm not particularly attached to any particular traditions around contract validity. I just want you to ask, does your system work? And I don't think, yeah, I mean, now we get to all laugh about it, but this has been a really this is a really big uphill battle. And it still is going on because sort of the training and the structure of sort of machine learning world is not necessarily conducive to this. But I argue that sort of having these tools of asking like sort of, does our system work? Does it do what we say it does? This is a way to actually help identify opinion assumptions about how our systems are designed. And this can give us a way to help diagnose or mitigate or prevent harm. And so if you want to go into that work, we've sort of spent a bunch of time thinking about different types of validity that are more useful for computer scientists. More recently, we updated this with the team at Microsoft Research, where they've been really sort of excited about this measurement framework to sort of clarify how specifically evaluating generative AI systems is, of course, yet another measurement problem. Or again, if you're trying to say my system is this amount safe, this amount high quality, this amount sycophantic, that these are yet again measurement problems. And that's important to separate conceptual debates from operational debates, as well as clarify where actually sort of non-technical stakeholders must be involved in a way that sort of can help round what kinds of understandings of the systems we're trying to build. So this is kind of my intervention on sort of a technical space, like this principle about working things. What if you build things? How do you know if your system works the way you say it does? That's the real goal here. But I want to sort of point out that this also gives us another way to think about what is happening with the uptake and use of these systems. In particular, because I would argue that measurement is this usually hidden, usually implicit, usually diffuse process where we create systems without necessarily having a super rigorously defined notion of what we mean by being a lawyer, intelligence, age appropriate, whatever, pick your favorite. But it's also that this is the way through which concepts are made real. And because these end up, as I said, sort of shaping our lives. And so I would argue that, to me, the larger story here is that measurement is governance. And that this is an important thing to pay attention to because in this process of turning those squishy concepts into things that govern our lives, a lot of stuff gets flattened, a lot of stuff gets thrown out, a lot of stuff gets simplified, all sorts of biases get drawn in. I'm not the person to make this argument, but I think the paying attention to exactly where and how and through what processes measurement is happening is going to be extremely important to understand how to intervene on real systems, how to understand what harms are happening to us right now, what's happening to governance of our and other people's lives. And so I've thought about this with a number of people at Berkeley. I've also thought about this. I can talk about the unhinged doll photos later, but we'll come back to that. But I do want to make clear that lack of attention to this process means that sort of values and assumptions in the systems that we interact with become entrenched and institutional and infrastructural. And so it's going to be extremely important to be able to pay attention to sort of specifically where the rubber meets the road in terms of how real systems are implemented and what things we're giving away when new systems are taken up, when systems are integrated into each other, when we say what works and is good based on the most recent blog post from pick your favorite AI company. And so that this is an important place to think about, especially because we're going to be describing also a shift towards this particular type of technical expertise, with a certain type of domain expertise about some of these important squishy concepts that I think we should care a lot about. I'll sort of come back to this. My quick caveats. Measurement is more than just psychometrics. There are a bunch of different traditions here. I want to sort of borrow more broadly from the social sciences. I also mention this because I want to move away from sort of treating AI as one thing for which we are ascribing these sort of human types of attributes to. And so I want to make clear that when I'm talking about measurement in this sense, I'm less worried about sort of different types of intelligence per se, even though I'm going to keep picking on that example, but also things like safety or reliability or sycophancy or, all of these things that are kinds of properties about systems interacting with systems that I might be interested in. So that's one. Sometimes when I talk about this work, I'm like, there are all of these harms that can come from sort of doing things with numbers, but there's measurement. And they're like, okay, so you're like a shill for big number. You just want to turn things into numbers. That's your goal. And I think, one, paying attention to measurement gives us ways to do things better, to turn things into numbers in more reasonable ways. But it also lets us more clearly trace what is happening, what things we want to push back on, what things should not be done, what things need to be sort of fundamentally revised. And then I also want to say that there's a much larger tradition of people studying quantification and classification, the consequences thereof. And that is a literature I'm very much excited about and engaged with. And I think it's important to be able to specify what some of those literatures currently cover and what is going on in terms of sort of this messier process around what I'm calling measurement. But I'm happy to talk more about that as we go on after. So again, I know I'm in high school, and so I really get to say, I hear you. And yes. And so I really just want to, again, sort of locate this in, there is a larger conversation about sort of measurement and how measurements both reflect structure in the natural world and impose structure upon it. And so that's really where I want us to focus mostly today. Is I would argue that uncovering the measurement process, really paying attention to that, is what is going to make hidden governance decisions legible, and that's going to be really important as we think about how to live in society, how to talk to technologists, all sorts. But so again, this gives us a way to look, and I want to show us a couple examples where we can actually, by paying attention to this, we can actually identify what kinds of values are being built in, what kinds of values are being taken up, whether implemented at large scale, for whom, why, where, because I think there's a lot of kind of like niche, boring, objective sounding, neutral sounding kinds of decisions that get made by all sorts of people that have these much larger consequences. And I want to show you that sort of we do have power, and particularly iSchools are extremely well positioned to explore what those values are, what's being laundered, what the impacts for society are. And that is going to be only ever more relevant. So I want to give you a couple examples from projects I've done with my students and outside collaborators. This in particular was with Arena Pasquetto, now in Maryland, and my fabulous student in Abdu. And we looked at sort of, again, kind of like a niche community, but specifically a community trying to do well. The FACT community, the algorithmic fairness community, which was in its nascent years, is sort of coming together as a community. And there was sort of this very well motivated work of sort of people saying, like, we know there's bias in AI and algorithms, and it's the problem. And so we're going to, look at race and fairness. And so we looked at the papers that said they did that. But I want to point out that famously, racial classification is a social and political project with important consequences. And I'm making light of I'm going to make light of a lot of sort of dark things happening in the world. And I just want to convey that it's not, I know. But I think there's something interesting about this particular niche community, because for one thing, what we see, again, in this sort of very well-intentioned project of looking at racial bias, we see something very explicitly formal happening, where this is actually a much more sort of explicit type of measurement, where people are trying to say we are paying attention to racial categories and bias, where they are sort of explicitly and quantitatively operationalized. And sort of the community in particular, and as we sort of can observe this now, a much larger sort of responsible AI, with interest tech, a much larger community, there's actually been some shift of basically power from what might have been a policy project about what kinds of sort of racial categories are protected and what kinds of systems are being implemented this way, to technologists. So there's basically this sort of technologists now consulting on effectively these sort of extra legal environments. And so we see things like Facebook uses some kind of racial classification algorithm. The Obama was written about this, where the way that tech will instrument racial categories will then be used in court cases, but for other contexts. So we sort of have this like interesting movement between where expertise is happening and where these projects are happening. So watch the Berkeley space for more cool work coming out in that direction. But we, so we looked at, we did this whole like systematic review. We find, these operationalizations and conceptualizations sort of very widely throughout literature, and these decisions are mostly not justified, but sometimes they are. But we saw a lot of sort of very sort of specific patterns. So we saw things like calls to legal frameworks, but much more frequently falls to things like, well, so easier with binary variables, or like, well, sensitive attributes. That's what we mean. We're going to sort of borrow these particular types of stylized ideas about what it means to study race by just looking at sort of other types of problems where we might want to like classify or do this kind of thing. And so you see all of this sort of computer science language comes through. We have some really sort of excellent quotes in the paper that draw from this past literature. Or they'll do things like, okay, well, we just draw on prior work. And we just draw on this skin tone scale. And you sort of get all this really funny moving around what it is that's supposed to be being counted and what's being intervened upon. But I think to me, this is just a nice setting piece that it just really makes clear, even among the well-intentioned, that, these are places where we are seeing, in this case, racial classification of all sorts of political projects that are unsettled, are quite hidden or not clear as, the algorithmic fairness researcher is not necessarily going to sort of make policy on certain kinds of fronts in terms of what is race, but it's a place where sort of policy is being made. And so I've used this sort of lens to look at a few other places. I'm going to talk a little bit about some practices around motion capture and computer vision, where we end up seeing practices of body measurement get encoded into sort of modern systems, because I think revealing where, again, these sort of practices get entrenched into our current systems is really important for, again, just paying attention to what decisions are being made for us and embedded in ways that are really hard to identify. And so in this one particular paper looking at, this is the cadaver in the machine, Emma Harvey is the first author, she's lovely. We looked at sort of what the role of sort of in particular errors were. We were trying to think about sort of how are people deciding what needs to be measured in order to make, in this case, sort of motion capture work. And so there's a lot going in here. In order to sort of show that any technology works, you compare it to the previous round. You say, look, my system is better than the previous one. This detects bodies better than the previous one. This one is faster than the previous one. This is cheaper. I can do things I can compare to the previous layer of technology. And in that, I'm going to sort of build on sort of past assumptions about like, okay, well, that's what a motion capture system does. It finds, the parts of the body. It finds sort of where something is in space, for example. And so I'll come back to this in a sec, but we figured out that, so the modern systems are much more about kind of like this faster algorithm, identifying certain types of behaviors. And so that's where sort of, again, I'm calling this emphasis on errors to be about, of like what being practiced relevant and needs improvement. And not just sort of assumes that like the project is stable. There's something like, we know what motion capture is, and these are the things we're trying to optimize within that. Prior to what we call sort of this like innovation era, there was sort of this like standardization era. People were really trying to say like, okay, we're trying to define what the problem of motion capture is. It might be something like, okay, things like, a sweater or hair might mess up what I'm thinking about. I need to sort of have something that can like be fast and not totally unwieldy, and maybe I want to sort of put markers on people so that they're more legible to the system. And so there was this sort of standardization error where people were sort of really trying to sort of make concrete what this motion capture task was. And like all nice progress, this was built on sort of this like stabilization of this idea of like what it means to measure a body in space. And so if you know anything about the history of body measurement and anthropometry, this is exactly the history you can imagine, where you do have, you go, like 2 citations back to get to some true skull measuring stuff. But you also see this, again, people are, many people are well-intentioned here, but you see things like, okay, we want to do some sort of initial body measurement tasks like ergonomics. I want to figure out how sort of pilots should fit in a cockpit. So what are we going to do? We need like, what's a body? What's the size of a body? How do we know? How does a body move? And so still, if you look back again, not very many hops back, the modern algorithms that compute how these sort of wire skeletons work are based on these calculated body segment parameters from a handful of frozen cadavers that were dismembered in the 50s and used to measure with basic physics models how human motion works. Because that is human motion works. So I'll just say that this is sort of a place where we can pay attention to. Again, by paying attention to this measurement, paying attention to what are people trying to improve. This gives us sort of a place where we can identify where certain types of these sort of historical assumptions, these are very like contingent paths from sort of then to now, things that are just sort of so fully, stabilized and embedded in practice that we no longer consider like what is the task that is motion capture, what is the task that is this body measurement. And so to me, this is sort of a really clear example of where sort of the sort of social practice around technology can be studied quite directly, and sort of we can think about what that means for what current systems, what shortcomings we should expect them to have, what things we might be concerned about going forward. And I love measurement, I love validation. I'd love to talk after about sort of what it means to be a gold standard, but just these sort of patterns of like, how do we validate, how do we know our system works? By comparing to the previous one is going to be a very clear way that we're going to launder some of those assumptions forward, launder for what's sort of neutral and objective. Bonus, modern computer vision systems are inheriting a bunch of practices for motion capture. There's a lot of interest in body measurement and representing bodies in space. And we're seeing a lot of these sort of similar types of pathologies sort of carried forward there. So we see, for example, there is sort of an interest again. People are trying to diversify. This is great. People are trying to get at, can we have sort of more skin tones? Can we have more body shapes? Because a lot of these sort of, a lot of these algorithms are based on like a Carnegie Mellon professor in his basement pretending to sit and pretending to play chess, or like 11 people. There's like this human 3.6M data set. It sounds like millions, but it's just like 12 people. And so you have all of this kind of, again, sort of pushes towards we're trying to get sort of bigger and more diverse, represented, do all sorts of things. And they'll do things like, so we're going to use this anthropometric survey from, I guess 2002, the Caesar data set. And they, oh shoot, I'm forgetting which world organization, it wasn't UN countries, but it's there's some set of countries that they drew from, which is not the set of countries of the world. And they sort of do this funny justification of like how they're sampling bodies. And it's like, well, we choose America, the United States, because it's the most diverse. We choose the Norwegians because they're the tallest, and the Italians because they're the shortest. They say it out loud. That's what they say. That's what the report says. You can go look at it. And now the people trying to resample and sort of make more diverse skin tones are just resampling sort of mixtures from that data set. And so you get all of this, like, people are really trying to be better, but you're sort of recycling the same thing and carrying it forward in all sorts of sort of funny ways. And really, and to their credit, what I've been noticing some more in computer vision, I've been noticing sort of better practice around, they'll at least like say, again, they'll say like, well, because they're taller, or like, well, we want more diverse, or like, well, we want to, they're a little bit more clear about justifying some of their decisions. Great. But, just a single justification, they're taller, doesn't actually really give us sort of this like larger historical context in these weird pathologies. So I want to pivot and sort of show you yet another place where we get this kind of like entrenchment of values and choices and some things. And I want to sort of specifically draw attention to this particular project is thinking about pre-training data for LLMs, but I want to sort of give you this insight and then move on to sort of what this means for other systems going forward. So in this project, so I'm in information school also. Ours also grew out of a library school. We have these people who think a lot about archives and knowledge infrastructures. And we were looking at sort of how pre-training data sets get made, what kinds of choices go into the data sets that we now use for all sorts of tasks. And you notice there are all of these sort of very classic archival processes happening, being used to do things like what counts as high quality language. Sort of this appraisal process, this selection of like, well, like Wikipedia or this thing that I can download definitely legally is a good choice. You have all of these sort of these classic archival processes. There's, fine, also not necessarily new. But I think this is important. Increasingly, as LLMs are a modern form of knowledge infrastructure. And so all of these archival processes that we know are important for what we can produce from those archives is going to be important to think about as we design better systems, think about what we can do with those. So I keep sort of mentioning this, like, this is this lovely high quality language, like language ideologies paper that turns out like white American high SES individuals are the ones that are being well represented by some of these choices. All of these punchlines are exactly what you'd expect, but I think they're just important to raise as sometimes you can see this thing that's like upstream having this clear downstream impact, like in particular this like high quality language study. But mostly these sort of upstream decisions, it's a much more sort of diffuse process of like, we know there's something going on up here. We know it's going to impact some things to some degree down here, but where we look and how we test that is going to be, it often sort of requires a much more indirect process. And so you can think about sort of what it means to sort of frame these problems of interest based on what people have already identified as like, these are the things that are important to measure about LLMs. This is what these companies say is important to measure. This is what the leaderboard is for, versus what actually we might care about in terms of either these upstream or these downstream impacts. And so, of course, we also see not very many stakeholders making a lot of big decisions. Not new, but again, sort of happening in sort of much more fast, diffuse. Let's go with domain agnostic type of context. So I just want to, I gave sort of, these are some examples of places where you can really sort of kind of like get a grip on something that's happening empirically in terms of how these values get instantiated. But I just wanted to kind of draw some attention to like, okay, pre-training data, again, that's not all there is to LLMs, but there are certain kinds of things that people are doing to try to like move through and sort of move towards better AI, and I don't want to dissuade those activities. But I already mentioned sort of one place where people are looking to sort of diversify or sort of ask better questions is thinking about that data, where we see a lot of this kind of same reproduced tasks where we are optimizing towards something that we've already well defined. This sort of these chains of concurrent validation of this, like, I'm going to show I'm better by showing that I'm better than the previous thing and not giving you sort of a metric on which you actually care about what that progress is. This is going to be a real case where we think about who is making decisions about doing things better. I visited AFOB earlier this week, and we chatted a lot about AI evaluation and standards metaphor. So in particular, we have these companies using language about what they're doing, things like child safety. This is OpenAI. In their purview of their technical safety team is child safety, privacy, elections, things, just a few things. And Anthropic is saying things like, this is our constitution. These are big words that are being create technical problems, which is, again, not inherently the problem. Partly they're saying it confidently, they're saying it loudly, and they're saying it in ways that are implying a level of expertise, of domain knowledge, of expert consensus that is not earned. So this does not match what the actual practice of developing, say, your election or child safety benchmark looks like. This is not a place where domain expertise is being valued, but these AI evaluations are being picked up with understandings of in particular, we talk about standards, but really what we're concerned about are these implications of domain expertise, of expert consensus, of this unearned legitimacy that's shaping how policy is getting made, that's shaping what's happening in the market, that's shaping, is there need for regulation, is there not need for regulation? All of this is coming around through these sort of very, I would say, misleading types of representations. So to me, that's an important place to be about that. I keep mentioning there's a conference happening at Berkeley on Friday from the Other and Belonging Institute. So keep telling people I'm super excited about the eugenics conference I'm going to. But this is a place there, especially in multimodal systems, we're actually creating a bunch of really new, fun, exciting ways to insert really strong assumptions about how faces work, what is revealable from the voice or the body, what can be detected about a person in ways that is very, very loudly and actively and proudly, in many cases, reanimating these sort of pseudoscientific traditions. So Mel Andrews, Abigail Burham wrote this lovely paper on sort of what the ethical repercussions are for that. But I think I want to sort of point out, particularly in this context of evaluation, where there is this sort of laundered legitimacy of what these tasks are. This is going to be a really important place to keep an eye on, because there's a lot of work that gets sort of passed through into what makes real tasks and what seems as a reasonable target, and what kinds of assumptions are made about people and their bodies and their lives. And so I just want to sort of draw attention to that. Some other very new work I'm working on with Clever, also thinking about multimodal systems, also just goes into sort of what, again, sort of what computer scientists have built into computer vision systems, and what we think real tasks are. So we've been thinking about sort of what we've been calling like the syntax and semantics of images. And so when I was putting this together and I was trying to sort of show my collaborator, like, yes, the computer scientists are using these words, but they don't mean them that way. I would say I'm cherry picking, but this paper has over 14,000 citations, so I feel like it's okay to pick on. But I really want to sort of draw attention to these validation tasks, which they are trying to do, these sort of much more diverse types of validation tasks. Evaluations are weird in these contexts. But I just want to draw attention to these two examples. So they chose these, and they're saying look, we want to reproduce this image. And they're different than ground truth, but they're semantically plausible. Like, has a head, is a body, is a mannequin, has horns. These are, whether or not this is a live body or a mannequin, at least having a head or not is I would call semantically not the same. And many humanists agree. And I just want to draw attention to this because this is not to say, oh, computer science is dumb. It's that there are sort of real systems of practice that are getting a lot of traction that are getting taken very seriously. And there are just some what I call bold assumptions about how the world works that get built in. And a lot of these aren't even being made very explicitly. They're being made in sort of hidden and subtle ways. Sometimes people tell on themselves and sometimes they don't. And so I just wanted to kind of give some anchoring for what some of these kinds of examples might be, because I think as we think forward about sort of where these measurement decisions are happening and trying to trace out what those impacts are and what the stakes are, I think that's really important. And so one place I've talked about with Deirdre, and again, many people here are excited about, I think, practices around oversight and accountability practices. Procurement is a particularly interesting place where we kind of have an opportunity to potentially intervene on these systems, where we get to pay attention to like, why are we buying it? What is it supposed to do? And how do we know if it works? So I think there is something actually really well aligned in terms of thinking about governing AI and paying attention to these types of processes. And I wanted to mention that, I started this out where I was like, this is kind of about teaching people that words mean things. And I wanted to, get computer science to use these words. And, this work has had some uptake. So the measurement stuff is in some of the like NIST frameworks and companies are using it. There was a plot in a paper in Neuro or ICML recently that, plotted these the phrase construct validity, and like the curve goes like this from 2020. And I'm not taking full credit, but I'm taking some credit. And sort of a practice I've talked about with a number of you previously, and there is still something that's happening over and over again because this ecosystem is just so what it is that, people are doing things like validating and saying, like, see, semantically plausible, see, my motion capture system is better. See this, reading personality traits from face and giving job options stuff. These tasks are being sort of laundered forward with a kind of legitimacy. And so I'm now kind of trying to sort of use this lens to really think about like, where are these places where we have validation like without validity. We were talking about AI evaluations in AFOG, and it's these sort of evaluations and standards, but like evaluations without standards was I think the line you used. But also we're seeing this sort of very, very clear, very explicit energy from, for example, Silicon Valley about sort of what the role of expertise is, who are experts in this space. This is already obvious, they do elections and child safety and privacy. Like, this is already there. But also who's an expert on what education is or what writing is or what poetry is. These are all things where there is a very clear actually sort of like anti-expertise, or rather sort of displacement of expertise to a different type of expert that I think is going to be also important to pay attention to. And so I think this is happening in all sorts of these aspects of these processes, which other people have talked about as well, thinking about, what does it mean to have these standards, or sort of what is transparency for and how is it being deployed? Someone else mentioned participation washing. What does it mean or accomplish to sort of like democratize or make some of these things open if you're not addressing sort of the parts we're concerned about? So, the good news is uptake. The bad news is we're sort of shifting to where some of the locus of this political activity is. And so, yeah, so that's my shtick. I think measurement is governance. I think not paying attention to that is a problem because this is where values really do become entrenched and infrastructural. And I think paying attention to what sort of gets embedded there is really, really sort of important. Something we're all particularly uniquely well suited to do in these translational spaces. And it also is important for thinking about who is able to and is given the level of expertise or is understood to have expertise in engaging with systems to make decisions. But yeah, we need to look at what values, what's being built into our systems, to our world, and what infrastructures and to what ends. As I said, I really do think information schools are a really exciting place for that. And I want to leave a lot of time for questions. So. I've also gotten some lovely collaborators. I've gotten some money. I appreciate it. I also wanted to just sort of leave us with these punchline sort of areas of where I wanted to maybe end our conversation. But let me just stick with thank you for now. Yes.
Thanks for that, Abby. I mean, I've watched you work on these things for years. I like what you do with them. But it struck me listening to your talk today that this is very like from CS, right? Here's all the things that like we're not seeing. Right? Some of this is the sort of norms and culture of the field, right? Where we're just following benchmarks, not looking outside of them. Some of it is maybe the black boxing of recent deep neural networks. It's hard to actually see what's in them. But it struck me that there's a sort of contrast here, right? Those of us who have left CS and do, STS outside, right? Part of the reason that I like working with technical objects in code is because all of these assumptions and these measurement decisions, like, well, at least they're written down. Like there's something I can actually look at and see like very clearly, very explicitly what it is, versus so many other social situations where like, this isn't written down anywhere, or it's written down in vague natural language, right? And so I wonder if you could sort of speak to this tension. Like in some sense, you've got the domain that is the most clear object to study this problem in. And in some sense, the way the field is structured and organized makes it the hardest place to see it.
I love that. And actually, I had this conversation yesterday with a student because even across computer science, there's variation in sort of what's sort of made more clear. And I was describing that, theoretical computer science is actually like very explicit about their assumptions. They're like, we assume like, everything about it is individual, and this is what fairness is. They're like, pick your favorite thing, which makes it sort of an easy target if I want to quote something, be like, no, people assume what these things mean, and then make claims based on them. But it's also kind of like the wrong target because they're saying their whole shtick is that like we have an assumption about how the world works, and then what we're saying is true within those bounds. When they sort of creep out of those bounds, I think that's an important thing. But I can sort of give them unfair penalty for saying the thing that they mean, which I want other people to say. So there's that. But I think maybe just to your point about in some ways, this is like a place where you are seeing this kind of measurement and action all the time. But I think the other thing you said about the way the markets, the way these companies, the way these fields are organized, make them also sort of particularly ill-suited for these kinds of interventions. So I'd say then for personally, I think a lot about how to get buy-in and what types of interventions are legible to different types of technical audiences. And so, I use, I think a lot about framing and what sort of who I want to listen to these lessons and to what ends, because I think part of my project is asserting what is in bounds of computer science, what is in bounds for what's a reasonable system, doing something that you're making claims about. I think, actually, this is the punchline. Like, I thought you were a good engineer, actually. I think there is sort of a real place where we get to sort of intervene on the system itself. And again, that's where sort of those of us who go through these transitions that are really hard to do. Yeah.
So I'm not sure how to phrase this exactly, but I've been far more in the practice side of the world, like that. So this is very interesting. But by the way, high school graduate, long time ago, makes sense. Eastern Europe. When you're talking about the measurements, are in the work you've been doing and you've been seeing, what are these measurements only sort of local outputs of the systems? Because what I'm trying to do is working with things that go out in your world that affect people. We try to work on outcomes for people. And of course, there's a streetlight fallacy, it's a lot easier to measure what comes out of your system while it's right there and fresh than going into the world and finding things. So whoever I'm looking for work that incorporates outcomes in the real world or how to incorporate those kind of measurements.
That's a great question, because I think one of the things you're getting to is right, like fields like program evaluation sort of have these kinds of pathologies about like what gets measured and what counts as effective. But also, I mean, and I want to draw attention to this phrase where you sort of said that like outcomes for people as a way to think about, or that's already, I think, sort of intervening in a really useful way in terms of saying like, what is the outcome for people that we actually care about? Is it like income goes up? Is it like has housing or healthcare? Like, you know, these are maybe types of things we would want to measure and optimize for. And so I think those feel much more useful than many of the things that like AI evaluations are sort of targeted for. They're also paying attention to the system that you're actually trying to intervene on. I think the something that this is the work I'm going to put you to anyways, something that actually you're doing, others have worked on is this notion of the handoff model, sort of if you're sort of having a technical system sort of take the role of some kind of you know, sort of policy making activity, or sorry, not policy making, but policy provisioning. Handing over a task is not usually so direct, and there are a lot of other things that sort of get done and get transferred into sort of what counts as inbounds, what does it mean to sort of enroll someone in something or to provide some kind of benefit. And so, to me, this kind of systems perspective of like, what is the system you're intervening on, what is the organizational context you're interested in, what are the actual outcomes you care about, is like a, sometimes it's more of an ethos, but we sort of can point to a number of theoretical lenses that help identify maybe places to look and keep an eye out for. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer, but it's a pretty hard problem to keep doing it.
Very low cost.
Excellent. Deb? Yeah.
So I'm all that working at the degree.
Yeah. Thank you for making that fun.
It became a thing, especially in the air LLMs, because they're very like underspecified technology. Don't know, like the vendors themselves don't even set restrictions around how people use the technology because they want people to try everything. But it becomes problematic when people's imagination sort of exceeds the capacity of what the model's doing, and you don't understand like whether or not what their imagining model can do is actually like overlapping with what the model can actually do. And I think one of the critiques of, I know we've written about validity a lot. I think one of the critiques of the language of contract validity is that it's very hard to operationalize. So like one approach could be coming up with more realistic benchmarks or benchmarks that like better represent those interactions with the model. But I think there's like a limited to how much that can actually help us understand what the model is doing when it comes to development. And so I'm curious how you see like sort of operationalizing some of these measurement ideals. And then sort of just a quick follow-up to the last question. I think that like some of the challenge here is people trying to operationalize their values through measurement, but I think another aspect of the challenge is that like, you know, evaluations are used to answer specific questions, like take action, like make decisions. And I think that's second, like sort of the utility of the evaluation. And I think sometimes those are determined by the values of the person setting a metric, and sometimes someone trying to estimate, you know, another stakeholder's values so that it can be useful for whoever needs to answer whatever question and make whatever decision or take whatever action. And so I think that there's some concern around that as well. Like, you know, how do we operationalize this and actually make progress on measuring challenges and validity challenges? And then the second question, I guess, like, how does like utility factor into this? And is that related to values? Maybe setting these measurements or metrics. Yeah.
Yeah, love that question.
Good question.
Well, I mean, a couple questions, yeah. And I am proud of Fenric for holding his tongue at this moment. So, but I think the critique about sort of is contract validity useful, it's totally valid. the evaluation task is the right thing to be doing at all. Like to say like, how do I know if my tool is general purpose? Like, well, did you ask if your measure of general purpose or whatever safety is like, is that an evaluation task? Is that the best way to make progress on doing that? So I guess I partly want to sort of put back on just a sense of like what questions we're asking and why that like, I think it's sort of not going, comfortability isn't going to be too much of the sort of fundamental like problem is ill posed. And like if your system doesn't actually do those things or you're sort of looking for types of outcomes that are not right. If that's not what poetry is, if that's not what safety is, like constructability isn't going to help you solve all of those problems if there is sort of this like fundamental ill-posedness. I think if you know, if there is something sort of good about those questions, or even sort of ways to identify what questions should be being asked, broadly, I just to me the sort of best description of sort of talking about validity is like, can you show that you did something reasonably well? And that as the like thing that I want to push for is, I mean, that's what I want. That's my like project. And I think there's, and you know, that might be an abuse to different sort of social scientific strategies around validity. And I think there are also reasonable things to take, but I think can we show that it's a reasonable thing to be doing, that we're doing it reasonably well, I think is a fun, I mean, it's hard, it should be hard.
Yeah, I guess this is related to my second question, which is like, to what end, where, like, some of the examples you're giving are from like a research context where people are just trying to rank or model of another model, publish it, or just declare the model as like state of the art. And that's actually very different to the way some benchmarks are used in like a practical administrative context. Like, you know, you mentioned procurement, you know, maybe even like pre-deployment criteria or something. And so I guess I'm sort of just like, you know, is in both contexts, like in one context, it's a little bit lower stakes. And so if constructability is not operationalized well, then it's a little bit of like a shrug. But then in the second context, it kind of actually becomes something that needs to be negotiated and made more concrete.
Yeah. So I think to me that's an opportunity. So I think the places where, right, like it could be reasonable for, if I'm a hospital and I'm thinking about taking on this system, I should have some follow-up questions, right? If in theory I'm a government agency and I'm adopting some kind of system, I should have some follow-up questions. I think that to me is where identifying what those tasks are and what these systems are actually being used for, is it reasonable, is it doing it reasonably well? I think that is actually sort of more naturally aligned. In some ways, I'm sort of picking contexts where it's easier to show that there is like, there have been decisions being made, or these are easier places where the stakes are lower. But to me, this is about, in some ways that's like proof of concept, like that, like this shouldn't be impossible. And so we have been working, and we're sort of, this comes out of the Microsoft collaboration, where we're writing about sort of, and actually a number of people there have been working on sort of how do you actually sort of use this framework to develop better evaluations. And so to me, that's, I think is a productive line of thinking. Obviously, I think it's, you know, self-serving to say that, but I think there is room to sort of use this to reverse engineer, like what do we want out of these systems and why do we want those things? And even if it's not designed with those values, what are the values we want to uphold and how would we measure that for doing that? So I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm excited to talk more one.
Yeah, I'm curious today in relation to AI benchmarks and measurements, are there any examples of measurement done well, so operationalized appropriately or made appropriately transparent to facilitate value interrogation?
That's a great question. So I think I want to point to sort of specific practices. So I think that's where where people are sort of making much more explicit efforts to do things like we implemented this, or we realized that this is sort of impacting these people, or we sat down and we laid out what we thought we were going to try to evaluate, and then we shopped that around to experts, and they said, oh, actually, like, yeah, everyone in our field thinks that that would be the wrong question to ask. You need to think about this kind of thing. So I have a couple sort of nice examples that have come out of that collaboration I mentioned, but I think I want to point to both the sort of like the immediate type of steps of like, here's what I'm trying to measure, here's what's in it. And you can look at places like, this is now sort of a funny dated example, but in the Compass data set, there's all of this like detail about like what's going into it. Same thing with like education testing. People will like write down all of this sort of justification for it. And that is well and good. And it lets us actually more concrete interrogate what's going on. But I think the sort of what questions get asked or what gets done with that data, what gets done, what those systems are that are based on this. You know, I was sort of obliquely referring to Kevin Baker's article in The Guardian recently about, you know, it wasn't like Claude Code or ChatGPT saying on the school, it was like, you know, this much more infrastructural, like an updated map basically of these sort of these like larger systems that are built on each other. So I don't know, you don't get a free pass by just like listing everything you do, but I think in the name of doing things reasonably well, that's a good practice, and in part because it lets other people see, and it sort of has an opportunity to sort of create the organizational structure that can more meaningfully intervene on those. That's sort of a cop-out answer, but I'm with that. Yeah. No, yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna relay some questions that were asked online.
Great.
So first up from Mike Rivera, says, great talk, thanks. How does one determine whether something, legitimacy, objectivity, authority, et cetera, is being laundered or not? And does this require us to understand the motives of the act?
Oh, I love that. I want to say it doesn't require, I'm going to start with a second. I don't think we need to know the motives. And in fact, in a lot of my work, I really try to avoid asserting motive because in some ways, right, like, so for example, we've done work looking at reports from the Government Accountability Office or you know, papers from FACT in this particular era, or scientific papers that talk about how they do body measurement stuff. And so I like using those sources because even if the motivation is not there, the things that they do in practice to justify their decisions, these are effectively the values that they're performing. And so it doesn't in some ways matter if that's what their intents are. In terms of detecting it, I think to me, anywhere where there is this sort of claim to sort of neutrality and objectivity, or this assertion of authority from an AI company or AI CEO particularly, those tend to be places where you know, that's the easiest place to detect where this might be happening. But I think the sort of much more subtle places about what's just being taken as like infrastructural, what is the sort of default that we're going off of. You know, we always have defaults, we exist in a world that is sort of contingent, but I think sort of paying attention to as we are engaging with systems and as we build them and design them and talk to people who do those things, it's really common, whether intentional or not, to sort of defer to technical expertise as a type of authority. And I think that there's some important slippage happening there in terms of expertise. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I'm curious, I mean, it's like, I think we had chatted a bit about how like these technologies that we're trying to evaluate are increasingly being used on like cultural things or things that are like a lot more like ill-defined, right?
Mhm.
And like part of the reason that like they're kind of hard to define is because a lot of them like require interpretation, right? And so like if you're interested in like can this LLM read a book, like you have can it answer questions about facts in the book, but also like can it do interpretation, right? Like can it interpret the book in like some kind of like close reading. And so I'm curious, like, it seems to me that like measurement theory is, or like at least leans very like positivist, right? And so like how, like do you think there are like limits to using like to apply measurement theory to like evaluation? Like how can we make room for the fact that like reading a book can be an interpretive activity in a world where like we're trying to measure everything in our evaluation?
That's a lovely question. Yeah, because I don't think everything is necessarily like sort of meant to be, I don't think everything should be sort of the most, that's quantification, the sort of particular type is not necessarily like the path forward. And so to me, this is like the second pragmatically answer is like, there's the like, doing measurements better, but then there's the other one of like, it's very revealing about what AI CEOs think about culture and knowledge if like reading a book is a bad thing. And so I think to me, this is a place where it's more about thinking about what is being sort of put forward in this like assertion of task that reading is dead and you don't need to do that anymore, for example. So basically what I want to do is sort of make room for those types of critiques and sort of help identify where something is being sort of either options are being sort of foreclosed upon or sort of certain things are being devalued. Even if that's not true. Right. It sounds like they're like pro reading, right? They're doing reading evaluations, but yeah, I think that's what I'm interested in. Not to say I have like sort of the everything answer for all things, but to me, this is kind of just my pragmatic lens on what things I'm interested in. Yeah.
Another question from online. Kelly Jones says, thanks for this important work. In working on these eval systems as a social scientist, I've noticed the arbitrary nature of decisions about how to translate information into machine readable formats. How can we create something like machine pedagogy to evaluate computer scientists' training practices? Folks training these models inherently do so in somewhat of a vacuum as companies compete to have the best benchmarks and evals. Could we build critical measurement into training pedagogy?
I love that. I hope so. So yeah, I mean, I think this is a really nice point of a lot of this goes to training, right? And so part of what my initial sort of struggle was that like, if you don't have the words for the thing you're trying to measure and the thing you actually measure being different, it's going to be really hard to like debug what goes wrong with that. And to me, this goes to like sort of asserting what is involved with like a good evaluation. For example, it is this kind of thing of what is actually the goal? What are you actually trying to put forward there? And there's also a version of a reaction to this that goes with, sure, like that's the ethicist's job, that's a sociologist's job. And that is a sort of very systematic devaluing that I think I want to push back against. And so this to me is sort of like, I thought you were a good engineer actually as a way to try to intervene on, for example, in computer science methods. So I do know this is now being taught in in a couple places, more than that. But I think sort of there are corners of industry practice. There are corners of sort of potential contexts like procurement where there's sort of an opportunity to sort of slot this in a way that's more aligned with existing practices in a way that we can sort of help build in value towards this kind of work.
Maybe just kind of dovetailing that on the procurement discussion, I wonder if you could, give some thoughts on what might be useful in terms of durability of some of these practices in a forum where, first of all, I'm sure most people are familiar with it, but especially in government, it's a team effort, often not collaborative team effort, to build procurement documents and procurement surrounding requirements. And as we've seen recently, when it isn't misaligned with the value set of building power, they can just simply control F, delete everything. So how might you think about embedding the practices that you're talking about in a way that persists, despite, human variability?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am partly underqualified to answer that, but what I can speak to from my own work, in particular, I think and this goes back to sort of paying attention to values. So something that, and going back to sort of quantification and measurement. With my student in Abigail, we looked at 50 or 60 years of government accountability office reports about the adoption of automation, algorithms, AI. And it does go back and forth. This is sort of this like agencies giving other agencies these kind of sort of assertion of like what should be legitimate in terms of efficient and non-arbitrary and it's the non-arbitrary is the third one. It's great paper. It's in there. It's sort of these aspects of legitimacy that are being put forward when agencies are arguing for the opportunities and the risks and the sort of management and accountability around using automated systems in these sort of government agency contexts. This is very not like consumer facing. This is very much like government agencies talking to each other about sort of what is good practice. And what I think one of the things that we found there was this very clear shift toward, and sort of, numbers have always been used to, sort of organize and rearrange power and all sorts of things. That's well understood in terms of quantification and bureaucracy. But I think one of the things that we observed is an increase in emphasis on efficiency as the reason to adopt these things. And so we had to update this paper because it happened. But there was some really interesting sort of discourse at the time because basically people were making fun of Doge, rightfully, but they were doing it in a way by saying like, well, this isn't even efficient. And what I think is really important is the efficiency being used as a value in this particular way is really the thing that has been sort of very proudly sort of been moved to dismantle the administrative state. And even in this sort of ostensibly like trying to bolster it, people were sort of willingly adopting this type of language and these values. And so my really long answer is that I think there's something about what gets sort of what the organization around what's being valued and why in government context is going to maybe be more or less protective of some of these sort of particular issues. But we've way hit my balance my car. But I would love to hear more. No?
I've got a question from Nancy. As someone who's transitioned from computer science to social science, I think it's important for those on the computer science side to understand that it's incredibly difficult to operationalize most interesting social science constructs. In particular, constructs tend to be operationalized within contexts and not across contexts, even within social science. For example, intelligence in psychology is a construct that is operationalized very differently in an educational context than it is in an applied context like intelligence for carrying out a specific task or a construct like emotional intelligence. I think it's an important discussion, and I'm wondering how to actually broaden it out.
Great question. Yeah, join the fight. Sorry. Yeah, so I mean, that's really, I mean, I think this is really where, there is something about, to me, this goes back, sort of pushing back on like who is an expert, and who gets to be an expert on this kind of thing, and thinking about what ways in which this is, this is like what gets valued, whose expertise gets valued. You know, there are clear financial interests in not doing some of these things well. So that, you know, that is at stake, but there also can be cynically like financial interest in doing them well. And so I think in some ways identifying which problems can be used to demonstrate the importance of domain expertise can be one path forward. And some of that can be external, some of that has to be internal. Yeah, I'm, you know, I have various things to say about sort of companies hiring social scientists, but a sort of a cheap way to say it is, you know, hire more social scientists and listen to them and pay them well. Yeah, but that's not really a prescription, or that is a prescription. It's not the most action. Yeah.
So after years of hearing everybody needs to become a data scientist, I'm glad to hear the data scientists think everybody needs to come campus.
That's this, like what if you're like an everything person? What if everyone needs to, no, it's not. But really my big thing is like, society exists, and that's like the real, like, you know, getting the data scientists and AI people, like society killed is the thing. So that's where I'm thinking about this.
All right, Shira Abramovich says, thanks for the talk. I've been wondering about the role of competitive benchmarking culture in measurement as governance. Is the competitive culture around evaluations, e.g. optimizing against / solving benchmarks, which has been critiqued lots for good and bad reasons, a necessary component of measurement being useful as a governance tool?
That's a great question. Thanks, Shira. Yes, I mean, I definitely think this sort of the AI evaluation ecosystem, I'm not the first or the last to say this, is particularly, has particular pathologies that are going to not necessarily make it conducive to doing measurement well. The incentives to say that your company deserves VC money, or you deserve this contract, or US is beating China. These are, you know, different incentives than what tasks are you trying to do what reasonable tasks are you trying to do reasonably well. I think there is going to, I mean, this is similar to Deb's question as well. And I think there is something really important about thinking about what this ecosystem is valuing and what our goals are with that to move forward. This is just like a much longer conversation. And so I would really like to chat more about